Senator from Wyoming.
Mr. President, I'd ask that the quorum call be set aside.
Without objection.
Thank you. I rise today to speak about the economic effect of regulations coming out of the Environmental Protection Agency on the energy sector, in particularly on fossil fuels and coal. The state of Wyoming is the largest coal-producing state in the nation. Coal represents almost 40% of the share of electricity generation across the United States. It's abundant, it's affordable, it's stockpilable, can be clean, and shouldn't be replaced through regulatory actions. But this administration continues to try and regulate coal out of existence. In 2012, the EPA finalized a standard that requires a strict reduction in air emissions from electric generating utilities. It's known as the Mercury and Air Toxic Standards Rule, and like many of the rules coming from the EPA, the cost of this regulation is great and the benefits are very limited. EPA estimates the rule will create between $500,000 and $6 million in benefits. That sounds like a lot of money. But related to the mercury reductions, the cost is $10 billion annually. $10 billion annually for a return of $500,000 to $6 million. That's a pretty big range, and indicates that there probably isn't a lot of calculation into how that went into being, or much transparency how we can see how it came about. Now, that $10 billion annual cost will be to the consumers of electricity. Those are costs that aren't allowed to be recouped. Now, many of those have already been put in place. They become part of the rate base, and under most of the laws dealing with utilities, they're allowed to make a return on that. So there wouldn't be a huge protest for it. It's a lot of upfront cost for them, but they get to recoup that over a period of time. We've got to be sure that when we're making regulations that we don't flood a whole bunch of them in there that have huge costs and very little benefit. We just had a hearing just a short time ago in the Homeland Security Subcommittee on regulations, talking about how all those costs come about. Well, the actual cost of doing it is pretty easily calculable. There are things that have to be bought and put in place and construction done in order to get it done. The benefits, a little harder to find out where those come from. And a lot of the things aren't clearly cut, that the problem comes from a single spot. Often there are a lot of things that are involved, but it's a tendency to pick on one place. So 3 years after the rule was finalized, the Supreme Court has ruled the EPA should have considered costs before determining to regulate mercury with the fossil fuel power plants. The cost-benefit ratio, assuming the EPA's best case scenario, is approximately 1,600 to 1. The court's majority opinion called this an overreach and stated, quote, "The agency gave cost no thought at all because it considered cost irrelevant to its initial decision to regulate." Now, since these standards began to take effect in April, utilities are already retired or plan to retire coal-fired plants to comply with the cost of emissions. Sometimes it's cheaper to shut them down than it is to make the changes. The courts did not issue a stay on the implementation, so companies began installing the mandated controls to meet the deadline for compliance. These costs will be passed on to consumers and will result in higher electricity prices. On average, a household can see their electricity bill go up by $400 a year, a cost which will disproportionately impact those with lower fixed incomes, like many older Americans. In 2012, Congress had a chance to use the Congressional Review Act to stop this devastating rule from moving forward. The Congressional Review Act gives Congress the ability to disapprove of rules that go beyond what Congress intended. It requires a simple majority for passage and was a legislative vehicle available to stop the MATS rule from moving forward. Unfortunately, it was rejected by the Senate majority at that time. Now, with the process, you have to get a petition that has a lot of signatures on it, and then you're guaranteed 8 hours of debate and an up or down vote. Of course, after it goes through the Senate, it also has to go through the House, and after it goes through the House, then it also has to go to the President for his signature. The rules and regulations are done by Congress, not by the President. The President's the enforcer of the rules that we supposedly put in place. So it should not take a presidential signature to stop the action if the House and Senate agree. Now, in this case, it was rejected by the Senate majority. So it wasn't until this lawsuit filed by state governors was finally decided that the agency was called out for charging ahead with this disastrous rule without considering the consequences. Ratepayers shouldn't have to wait this long for the correct decision. Congress has to stand up to this runaway agency, but we need to expand on our tools to fight governing by rulemaking. We need to increase accountability for and transparency in the federal regulatory process by requiring Congress to approve all new major regulations. The regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny, REINS Act, would ensure that the people's representatives get a say in the regulatory action affecting our nation's economy. The presumption should not be deference to a federal agency attempting to implement a regulation, but to Congress and to the states. If enacted, the REINS Act would require an up or down vote by both houses of Congress before any executive branch rule or regulation with an annual impact of $100 million or more could be enacted. In the case of the Clean Power Plan, the costs are in the billions, so it would ensure Congress gets a say to stop the EPA from regulating coal out of business. Additionally, the Environment and Public Works Committee has moved legislation. That's the Affordable Reliable Energy Now Act, which would extend the proposed rules compliance dates pending further judicial review. That way we don't see the premature plant foreclosures that harm our grid reliability and make energy more expensive before even knowing whether the rule is on good legal standing, whether the numbers are good. Both of these bills would give Congress additional tools to fight executive overreach, and the House has already passed legislation similar to the Affordable Reliable Energy Now Act. We must do what we can because there's no doubt that MAT's regulations will continue to be challenged for its requirement of outside of the fence lines changes, its coordination with existing source performance standards, the implementation of federal standards should states not submit plans, or on the scientific basis if the status quo contributes to the endangerment of public health. In fact, the White House has requested over $50 million to defend the rule in court. That's your tax money. They've already lost once. And while the EPA ignores the costs, outside groups have projected 4 to 7 times the cost of the regulation. The National Economics Research Association found an annual compliance cost for MATs ranging from $41 to $73 billion. That's the annual compliance cost. So that would be up to 73,000 millions, as I like to put it. I think talking about millions instead of billions makes it a little more understandable. So that's the policy that's going to affect consumer prices. It also shows that states like Wyoming seeing double-digit increases in electrical prices. Congress must ensure the EPA does not continue to act unreasonably by not considering the cost of compliance before drafting carbon regulations. By requiring states to implement their own plans, the EPA is trying to skirt their responsibility to determine the true costs. The EPA has not adequately considered the costs of the Clean Power Plan. Yes, what they've done is shifted that over and say, states, this is what each of you has to do to make the federal plan work. But since this is a state plan, we don't have to do all of this analysis to see what the costs are going to be. Of course, we need more transparency in the calculations. As I mentioned, costs are easy to come up with, benefits are pretty hard to determine, and they're kind of in the eye of the beholder or the eye of the calculator. And usually the cost happens up front in just a few years, 5 years, maybe 10 years at the most. But they're allowed to calculate the benefits over 50 years, 100 years. How long can they do that? The consumers have to pay it up front, or the company has to pay it up front. The consumers have to pay it over a regular short period of time. 15% of U.S. coal generating capacity is already planned for retirement. Wyoming would be forced to prematurely close 4 additional coal-fired power plants under this rule. Yet the EPA, incidentally, that's about the amount of electricity that we export to California. The EPA asserts that since states determine compliance, the remaining useful life of coal-powered units prematurely shut down need not be considered. Governors have already begun telling the EPA that they will not be able to submit plans to meet the proposed standards. So Administrator McCarthy has threatened a federal implementation plan if states do not comply. Now, a federal implementation plan is a federal regulatory action. And so they need to consider the costs of premature plant shutdowns and the consumer energy prices that will cause prior to being finalized. You can't bypass these considerations by placing the onus on the states first. Congress also needs to empower states to oppose federal regulations that hurt their constituencies, again with little benefit. As Wyoming's Governor Matt Meads commented on MATS, the EPA does not have the legal authority to propose, finalize, or enforce this proposal. The EPA has introduced a proposal that functionally and structurally hamstrings energy and electricity sectors, driving up the electrical prices. It would burden our nation's economic security and prosperity with almost no environmental or health benefits. The state of Wyoming is considering its legal options once the rule is finalized. Can't do anything until it is finalized. I have proposed an amendment to the Constitution which would give states the ability to repeal federal laws and regulations when ratified by 2/3 of the legislators. That's almost like calling a constitutional convention under Article 5 of the Constitution. This amendment stands up for states' rights and gives them another option, other than the court system, to find solutions to regulatory problems. Ultimately, the states know what is best for them, and it's time to shift the power back into their hands. Even when federal regulations may have good intentions, they can create situations in which they cause more harm than good. Unfortunately, the regulatory process is skewed in favor of the administration. We need to find a way to empower Congress and to empower the states, those most accountable to the voters, to keep runaway agencies in check, or we'll continue to see regulations that impede our economy by directly hurting the energy industry, which hurts individuals, costs jobs, and hits the ratepayers, a price ultimately paid by the consumers. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.